Welcome to Slice Property Made Possible. This season we meet with experts and everyday people to discuss their property journeys so you can learn from their mistakes. Head to today's episode notes to get access to our free home buyers software and to get an estimate of what you could borrow today. Awesome. Welcome back to another episode of Slice Your Property podcast. Today we are joined by the amazing Nicole Bremner, who has obviously had her own personal experience with property, but gone on to become much of a property mogul and is here to share both some challenging experiences that she's had, but also some tips and tricks for those that might either want to get on the ladder for the first time or be looking at building their portfolio. So thank you so much for joining us, Nicole.
Thank you, Amy.
Great. So we start these episodes off by basically just giving you the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about what your first home journey was like, because we all have to start somewhere. So what is it that you can remember about that, Nicole?
I think I'd have to go right back to childhood, which sounds like I'm about to lie down on your sofa. But I think my parents were obsessed with property. They were both nurses. They worked really, really hard with 4 children. But we would spend Saturday afternoons, and I remember this so clearly, driving around Sydney, looking at various new properties. And they loved areas like Dural and those lovely leafy suburbs. And yeah, we would just look at properties that were being built. They would discuss ideas, and us 4 children would be sitting in the back of our van, trying not to fight. So, and then my parents eventually built their own home in Coffs Harbour, on the outskirts of Coffs Harbour. And that was really my first exposure to that, because my dad, he was very practical, my mum too, and they self-built their home. It took years, but in the end, it was this incredibly beautiful, long Queenslander style property that was just lovely. So yeah, that was my very first memory. And I've just been obsessed with property ever since. And I could not wait to buy my first home. But then I moved when I was 22 to London. And that put home ownership quite a bit out of reach. It was just so expensive at the time. At the time, the Australian dollar was 3 to £1. So it was even more expensive. So then eventually I did buy my very first flat with my partner at the time. And yeah, that was just an incredible experience, becoming a homeowner for the first time.
Yeah. And do you remember, obviously, the financial challenges, but do you remember what your challenges or what the experience was like actually going through that process of finding the right property, getting finance, and then even doing your due diligence and things like that? Now you've obviously done it so many times that it's sort of written in stone, I imagine, your process, but that first time is always a bit trickier.
Yeah, it is. And that's something that you need to remember. I always say this to people, when you drive to the airport and there are people going everywhere all over the road, you've got to remember this is their first time, or they only drive to the airport once a year. So you've got to cut them some slack. And it's the same with property ownership. When I'm going through the process, I sold something recently. I bought and sold last year. And I have to remember that this is a transaction that people only do a few times in their life, whereas for me, it is just churning them over. But yeah, I do very clearly remember that first time. It was I think the thing that struck me most was what a compromise it was to purchase property in London, and how you could not find this perfect property. You had to compromise on something. And parking was a really important factor for my partner. For me, it wasn't. I didn't really care whether we had parking or not. I just wanted somewhere quiet. And it was on a really busy main road that we could hear ambulances and police cars going along. But I do recall that it was our home and it had some really lovely features as well. As far as the finance, we'd been in London for how long? About 4 years by that time. And we had built up quite a nice deposit. He had some inheritance. I had a payout from a bonus from a bank that I'd been working at. So we were able to pool our money together and buy this first flat. And it was back in the time where it seemed easier. Things just seemed easier back in 2004 to buy property and to get finance. And it just we were new to it, the whole conveyancing process. And yeah, it was just a really interesting experience and it was quite fun.
I imagine the finance part as well, obviously with your background in banking, often you end up with a deal when you when you have sort of got experience at a bank, they can give you staff rates and things like that. But also you're sort of a bit more clued in as to how finance works. The conveyancing side and the legal side, doing your reviewing the legal documents. How did you go with that? Did you have a lawyer help you? What was that process like for you?
Yeah, in the UK, you definitely have to have a conveyancing solicitor who will review all of those documents for you and pushes the sale through with the conveyancing solicitor for the vendor, the seller. So we definitely had to have that. And yeah, I remember it being quite a straightforward process. You had a motivated seller, a motivated buyer, and it just all went through really smoothly. And in hindsight, I realized that that's quite rare. But at the time, it was all quite easy. And I think also when you're buying your first property, you have no expectations. You might have heard horror stories from people about things falling out of bed because of the contract, or people deciding that they're not going to sell, or people deciding they want more on the day of exchange and things like that. But we didn't have any of that. We had no expectations. For us, it was just a straightforward process. And with the financing, we both worked in banking, but our the banks that we worked for didn't offer any financing. But you're right, Amy. We knew the basics. We knew what interest rates were. We knew what repayments were. We knew whether it was going to be an interest only or a repayment mortgage. So yeah, it was a bit easy for us having that financial acumen, I guess.
Yeah, so it sounds like the biggest challenge, which is a challenge for everyone really, is just actually finding something that's suitable for your needs. And when there's two of you, then, coming to a shared understanding as to what those needs are, which often there is. Most people do buy,
Yeah.
with their partner the first time. So big step up though for you from, that first purchase to then falling into somehow in some way into property development. So can you tell us a little bit about that transition and how that all occurred?
Sure. Well, shortly after purchasing that property, 4 years, 3 years later, we ended up moving to New York. And that was really good because we had 2 years where all our living costs were met by the bank. And it was a fantastic time to save money and really decide what we were going to do. And at the same time, over those sort of 4 or 5 years, the price of our flat that we'd bought in London, the apartment, had doubled. And so we were really fortunate to have this double whammy of the flat doubling, the apartment, and our income had increased. Plus, we were able to save a lot of money not having any living costs for 2 years. It was quite remarkable. We also came back with one baby and another on the way. And that also changed where we were going to live. We just could not fit in our small inner city London flat anymore. So that's when we rented, and we rented in an area that we thought we might like to buy in that was just slightly out of the city. And we really got to know the area. And because of the money that we'd saved and the way we were able to sell that other flat, we were able to afford a much bigger house. And that was fantastic. And that gave me my first foray really into property. We bought an old vicarage in East London. I ended up, it was derelict. It was just such a beautiful property. I walked into that property and just went, oh, I have to have this property. It was such an emotional purchase. My partner spent the rest of the day just crunching numbers. And then I remember him ringing the estate agent and we put an offer forward. And by the end of that day, I think it was accepted. It was all very, very smooth. But that then I renovated because it was, as I said, derelict. And so I renovated that and I had a really good experience. And looking back, I realized just how unusual it was to have really good experiences at these sorts of things because most people have a nightmare. And since then, I've had nightmares. But at that particular time, it all worked really well. Renovated this beautiful vicarage, made it into a wonderful home. And then I had 3 young children, aged 3 and under. and I was thinking about what to do next. Couldn't go back into banking because it was just, I couldn't with 3 young children. I wanted to be a mother who was present, but I still wanted to have something that I could do to, to give me a sense of purpose. And that's when my partner said to me, well, you've done really well with this renovation. Why don't you do another property? And I'd watched Homes Under the Hammer and Grand Designs and things, and that was really my only exposure to it. So that was it. And I thought, well, there's something in this. And I had kept track of all the property prices in the area. I had spreadsheets of what their asking prices were, and then you can see the selling prices a few weeks later. So I tracked everything. And so I had a really good idea of these prices. And that's when I then decided to take my first step into professional property developing. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know that I could borrow money from the bank for that. I thought that I would have to just put all our money in. And so we had saved a bit of money again, and I bought my first investment property, which I never wanted to be a landlord. I always wanted to buy, renovate, and sell. And I was very fortunate that the area that I'd chosen was one of the fastest growing areas in all of the UK. And I guess the rest is history. I did numerous properties and rode that wave up until it collapsed.
Yeah.
And that's the next chapter.
Yeah, that's the next chapter, absolutely. But it's interesting just to pause there for a moment, because there are different strategies. Obviously, you can flip, which is sort of closer to what you did there, where you were buying, financing, renovating, selling, as opposed to going, we're going to buy and hold and, manage the finance cost over an indefinite amount of time, and also then have to manage, tenants or Airbnb occupants or what have you. So what was the thinking there? Was it just, was it finance related, or what was it that sort of meant that your strategy was you want to get in and out with those properties?
I really didn't want to deal with tenants. I'd had a little bit of experience of it when we moved to New York and we'd let out our flat. And I just, even though I had great tenants, I just didn't like the fact that things go wrong in properties and there's wear and tear. And I had to ultimately be responsible for that. And even though we had a managing agent, it's still them calling me saying, well, what's going on? Can we fix this? Do you give us approval? In the end, I was just going, look, anything under 1,000, just do it, please. Don't bother me with it. But still, they have to check, and then boilers go and the surface of the terrace started bubbling and all these other little things. And I thought, I just don't want to deal with that. So plan A was always just to buy, renovate, sell. But there were some instances where I've had to keep them, and I've tenanted out, and I've had very mixed experiences. Fortunately, I've got one flat that I rent out directly right now, and I've got 2 lovely New Zealander girls in there, and they're wonderful
Hey,
tenants. Yeah.
of course they
So
are.
they are. They're lovely young ladies, and they're staying till September. And actually, the only reason I'm keeping the flat is because they've asked to stay until September, and I thought, oh, they're such lovely girls. Even though I'm losing money now, I'll keep them in there.
Oh, that's
So yeah.
so nice of you. Yeah, you're the New Zealanders.
Yes,
So
exactly.
yeah, I mean, it's obviously tricky with tenants. I mean, I've had them myself, and now I'm actually trying Airbnb, which
Mm,
is a different kettle of fish, and I'm still new to that. But yeah, it's just a cost, isn't it, to
yeah,
maintain a property when you've got people moving through and tenanting. So
yeah,
even though I guess it just adds to, yes, your admin, but also there's an ongoing, kind of financial element, as opposed to being able to leverage bank financing to kind of get that all done, rather than holding that financial risk over time.
yeah.
Um, I know you've also moved into the kind of joint ventures space, and that's another way that perhaps you've been enabled in your kind of scale. Because how many properties is it that you've moved through to date now?
125 and a half. And I say a half because
Wow.
last year bought a property that I owned a share of. I bought it outright and then I sold it immediately. So that was kind of a half because I already partially owned it. So yeah, 125 and a half properties, including my home that I'm doing. And I'm just about to renovate another property that I own with my partner. So that will be my number, I guess, number 126 and a half.
0.5.
So yeah, exactly. So yeah, I've done joint ventures with mixed success, I will say. One interesting project that I did was a joint venture with someone who owned the property, and they were in a situation where they had this beautiful apartment in South London, and they'd had some flood damage. They couldn't afford to renovate it after the flood damage. They'd used the insurance for other purposes, and they really needed to sell this flat. And so I said, fine, I will renovate the property. I'll pay for the renovations, and then at the end, we will split the sale price less my costs. It worked really well at that time. I'm not sure that the numbers would work in their favor going forward, but for us, it worked really well. I think we spent about 40,000 on the renovations. And then we made about 200,000, which we then split, and that worked incredibly well. So that was a nice little joint venture that I took on the risk there. But again, I could see that it was going to be worth that risk to take that. And also, I really wanted to help out a friend.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, it's a win-win, isn't it? And also, though, I guess the risk that you take on is in some ways slightly smaller than if you actually purchase the entire property and then renovate it, because that's a greater kind of investment amount. But I guess there's more risks in having other parties involved in the venture and just complications with people,
Yes.
which is the biggest risk of all.
Always.
But yeah, and so moving back to what you sort of mentioned is you rode that all the way to the top until it collapsed, and now we're in a very different market now than we were when you started out on this venture. What does that look like for you now with your portfolio? Have you exited things? Are you holding things? So you've got most of your properties in the UK, is that correct?
All of them. Yeah.
All of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously this will be sort of market specific to the UK, but we're seeing kind of global trends are in many ways somewhat similar in the property market at the moment. But just for those listening in the UK, obviously it's different to New Zealand, Australia, US. So yeah, what does that strategy look like for you today? Because it's obviously a very different market from when you started.
Yeah, it is. And I was also really naive when I first started. For full disclosure, I mistook my luck for skill. And I really did think that everything I touched turned to gold. And in hindsight, I realized that I was just very fortunate to buy in the right area and ride that wave. There was a lot of hubris there. And what we had in the UK was this triple whammy. We had a Brexit vote, which meant that all the foreigners that prop up the UK market no longer wanted to be there. But also, we had a huge skilled workforce, particularly from places like Poland, where their skills are really, really top notch. And they left. They went, well, we've made all our money over the last few years building here in London. We're going to take it back and buy amazing properties in Poland. So they all left. And that was all thanks to Brexit. We then had Section 24 changes to tax, where landlords could no longer offset their mortgage repayments against the property, as well as a whole lot of different costs that they could no longer offset. And that meant for most people, being a landlord just did not make sense. And again, that lowered demand. And then finally, we had an increase to the stamp duty land tax. So we had, or any foreigners would have to pay an extra 3%. And anyone with second homes had to pay an extra 3%. So again, it just took it really took the air out of the
market,
of that market. Yeah. And that was 2016. We're now obviously 10 years on, and there are still parts of London who haven't recovered since 2016. It really did deflate that market, especially around Kensington and those sort of West London areas where they really did rely on the foreign buyers. So that really knocked me financially. It knocked my confidence as well. I didn't buy another property from 2016 until very recently. And then, so what I was then stuck with 110 properties and didn't know what to do with them all. And there was just no market. And I thought, my goodness, this is the end. And then what happened was COVID. And at first I thought, this is the end of the end.
Yeah, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, as I know happened in Australia, is everyone was, right, we're home, we've got nothing to do. Let's buy property.
All of a sudden, I can't spend that money on travel, so that money is going to property. And the same thing happened in New
Exactly.
Zealand as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. And all of a sudden there was demand for properties. And so I sold nearly everything during that slight uptick during COVID. And that was quite fortunate for me in that regard, that I was able to sell a lot of those positions and stabilize some of those positions. So because I was really worried, things were quite precarious financially. And there were other factors that I won't go into, such as some financial misdemeanors, shall we say, from a business partner, and which is still ongoing right now. And it just really took its toll. But fortunately for me, I was able to exit a lot of those positions. I still hold about 21 properties now. Most of those I will sell over the coming months, and some of the commercial units, I'm not sure. Commercial is very, very different to residential, and it's a trickier market. So yeah, it's just been about stabilizing and selling down. So what it looks like at the moment is I've got one property I own directly that I rent directly. I'll keep that until September, and then I'll look to put that on the market. I've got my 2 homes, principal residences, and I will keep those 2 until such time that I can sell each of those and buy one for the family. But all the other properties that I own in companies, I will look to sell those. I don't really wish to be a landlord anymore. So yeah, I guess my outlook now is I was too over concentrated in property. And real estate is a fantastic asset class. It's something that we can all get very passionate about because it's very tangible and we can
Yeah,
see it.
tangible.
And we all live in homes, so we think we know about them. But actually, I was over concentrated in property, and it really put me at risk. And so now I've diversified my portfolio much more. So yes, there's still real estate, and I can't stop looking at the property portals and thinking about, oh, there's a great deal. I could do this to it. We were doing it last night in bed. So it's still something that I know will be in my future. But at the moment, I just want to make sure that I'm really well diversified and not just fully concentrated in property, because it's quite dangerous.
Yeah, and absolutely. And it sounds like, the strategy that you had at the beginning, obviously the market changes and then that strategy doesn't always hold. So,
Yeah.
buy, sell, renovate, buy, renovate, sell is fine, provided there's someone there to buy it when you sell.
Yeah.
But if you get stuck with a bunch of properties, then all of a sudden your strategy shifts rightly or wrongly or without your consent to landlord.
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
know, so it
exactly.
sounds like that's sort of what happened, is like that was all working smoothly while there were plenty of buyers in the market, but then you basically had to operate as a landlord, at which point, your cash flow is under pressure. You're in a different situation than actually taking finance,
Yeah.
flipping that on and taking a profit. All of a sudden, you've actually got to maintain the costs of owning that
Yeah.
portfolio and the stress and the admin of dealing with tenants and
Hmm.
things like that. So I guess
Yeah.
that's the reality. It's amazing also and very authentic of you to share and say, actually, I was sort of overly confident when I kind of started out on this venture, but it's also one of those qualities that actually breeds success, I think, is entering something with a little bit of naivety and a little bit of optimism, because otherwise you'll never get started and you'll never do it. Like,
Yeah.
if you were overly pessimistic, you never would have got to the point where 125.5 properties later, you've got this wealth of
Yeah.
experience in this portfolio.
Yeah.
And so I think kudos to you for that, but also for, yeah, I think the authenticity and recognizing, there were lessons learned along the way around, as you say, diversifying your portfolio, or the fact that actually, um, you know, quite quickly market changes can impact, I guess, what you thought
Yeah.
was a sound strategy. Because it's similar, actually, what happened in New Zealand as well. I was impacted personally by that. Not that I have 125 properties,
Mm.
but government makes change, and then all of a sudden you can't write off, interest rate
Yeah.
expenses as a cost, and that can literally be, the difference between. I can't remember what the tax bill that I got. It'll eventually cut back, but it becomes a cash flow issue of around 20K or something, like, on one property. So it can very quickly become a challenge if you've got that spread across a bunch of different properties happening year on year.
Yeah. No,
Um,
exactly.
but it
And the
sounds like,
interest rate spiked as well. And I'm sure that
yeah,
happened in New Zealand and Australia as well at the time. But yeah, we had the interest rates went from being nothing to 5, 6, 7%. And the whole industry's changed now since then, where the establishment fees that lenders are charging now make it just untenable, but it just, the numbers don't stack anymore. So I think the banks have got used to the higher interest rates, and now that interest rates are coming down, they're still putting over these really high setup costs. So yeah, no, you're right. It's things change and they can be out of your control. But as far as property, it's still a fantastic option as part of a balanced portfolio. And also
mm.
trading up your homes and then trading down is a really good strategy, because obviously there's tax incentives to owning your own home. And it's a really nice way of just building your wealth there as well, in a tax effective way.
And you move money away from rent that you would pay anyway into your own home. Like, there's lots of benefits to that for, owner occupiers that are buying their first home,
Yeah.
for example.
I will say though, every single time I have cash flowed this out for someone in their 20s. So I'm a chartered financial planner. I qualified in Australia in 2003. And every single time I've sat down with someone in their 20s and mapped out renting versus buying a home, the renting and investing always comes out better. But it's psychological. There's a psychological benefit to owning your own home, really establishing roots and having that ability to make the changes that you want, and then commuting that onto other properties. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And I know people like Grant Cardone are always going on about don't buy, rent, but that's discounting the psychological benefits of having a home.
And the reality of how people use their money as well is, once
Yeah.
you've got a mortgage, you have to move your money there.
Hmm.
When you're paying for rent or whatever, actually all of a sudden you might end up paying more because you want to live in a place that's a little bit, it's a money mindset thing that
Yeah.
I think can look quite different. And so you're building that equity as well within in a property. And one thing I will say is, it's incredibly, in Sydney at the moment, it's incredibly hard to get into rentals, and then you get moved out because owners are, wanting to renovate and rent out for more. So there's obviously, we at the beginning of the episode, you talked about making an emotional purchase, where you're living is emotional. So agree. There's some different things to weigh up in terms of ownership and renting, but certainly some benefits and some costs to each approach. And I love what you
Yeah.
said around, it's that balanced portfolio. It's not one or other. It's actually, how can have a bit invested in stocks, have a bit invested in property. What we see a lot of the time is people invest in stocks, then use that to buy their first property, and then from there go back into stocks. And so
Yeah.
it's all about, I guess, as you say, with your financial planning, it's going to be taking into account each individual's goals and circumstances as well. But going back to sort of your experience as well, because it sounds like there were lots of lessons that were learnt almost later in your property experience than kind of with your first home purchase. What were some of those, like if you could pick out the key learnings or mistakes from your uh, property journey, including every purchase, what would those be, Nicole?
I think the first one is to have that diversified portfolio. And again, I'm not talking about your first home. I think you almost need to park your home and say, right, your home's your home. But after that, when you're looking to invest any excess that you have, don't put it all in real estate. Look at diversifying and look at building up more tax effective ways of building your wealth. And only when you get to a certain level might you consider having real estate. Or many people become accidental landlords because they trade up and decide to keep, or they move in with their partner and keep one of the houses. But I would encourage people to really seriously consider that. Don't be overweight in any asset class. The markets are cyclical and they often move against each other. So it's really important to have that diversified portfolio. That's the first thing. The second thing is, unfortunately, trust no one. Have contracts in place for everything. And the best contracts you never look at again. But you know that if anything were to happen, you can go back to those. And it may not be, you may have a fantastic business partner, but what if something happens to them? What if they lose capacity? What if they die? You're not dealing with them then. You're dealing with perhaps
Their
a
family or
spouse. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And they're mourning, they're desperate, and they will do whatever they can to protect their position. So have those contracts in place. Never trust a handshake. And I know that people find that quite a harsh thing to say, but it's true in everything. Just have that contract in place. And then if things go wrong, it's
You're
there. And so,
preaching to the choir here. My background's law and I'm just very strong. So we offer things like contracting out agreements actually and co-ownership agreements and the like through our software, and any kind of legal kind of structures to help people through. I mean, you'll be talking obviously more when you're going into business venture or joint venture to co-purchase property, which is slightly different. But yeah, absolutely could not agree more that just having that clarity protects you from all the, potential relationship breakdown that can occur
yeah.
down the line.
Even with a partner, a life partner, having
Yeah.
that contract, let's just say you're putting in 60%, they're putting in 40%, just having that contract that clearly sets that out, even from an estate planning perspective, is incredibly important because you don't want their beneficiaries to get more than your beneficiaries when you've put more in. So yeah, it's very, very important from so many different aspects. And a lot of friends are buying homes together now too, because they may not have met a partner and they want to be homeowners. And again, it's not good enough just to have this agreement between you, a verbal agreement. As you will know, Amy, just get it written down, get it in a contract. And also, there's nothing like sitting down and writing a contract together or writing out the key points that you want to help clarify your views and clarify the what ifs. What if you get a boyfriend and want to move out, and or the boyfriend wants to move in? What happens then? I don't want to share with a male. I wanted to share with you. So it just
Yeah.
clearly spells out how things will be under all the various circumstances.
We've had some really interesting situations and scenarios where people have then had a baby. So then there's a baby that's
Mm,
now involved and it's, did I sign up to live with your baby? So, it can get very complicated very quickly. And yeah, for those that are listening in, we have this free decision making tool for people to go through and actually, as you say, if you can't have those, if you can't cover off those decision points before going ahead and even making a purchase, and of course, ideally getting that contract validated by lawyers, then perhaps you should not be purchasing together in the first place. But yeah, I mean, the other thing we see, Nicole, as well, is people don't want to spend on, legal services or
yeah.
don't want to spend on doing the due diligence. What's your kind of view? And obviously, you'll have that process down packed now when it comes to, reviewing the title, reviewing all the legal documents. But um, how does that process look for you now?
Yeah, I can't help but think of that saying that you pay once, pay right, or pay bad, pay twice. I can't remember the saying now, but it's so true in that, look, I didn't have the right contracts in place. And I have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds fighting as a result of that. My legal fees are huge. And had I have had the right contracts in place from the outset, then I wouldn't be in this position. I'd probably still have some legal fees, but certainly nowhere near the amount that I had. And so I cannot stress enough to people how important it is to not scrimp and save when it comes to legal, because unfortunately, with the law, and it doesn't matter what country you're in, it's not who's right or wrong that wins or loses, it's who's got the deepest pockets. And you can have a fantastic solicitor and be wrong and still win. And that's what's so devastating about the legal system. So the best thing you can do for yourself is to ensure that you have the right documents drafted, the right solicitor looking at your situation right from the very outset. And trust me, it will save you 10 years of pain and a lot of legal fees. So, yeah, I cannot stress that enough.
It sounds like that's one of the biggest learnings for sure then. And look, we only, unfortunately, often we learn these things through experiencing and making mistakes, but that's why it's so useful to have someone with your expertise. And, for anyone listening, I'm sure that it's inspirational to think, hey, this person who has managed to make her way through 125.5 properties has also recognized that perhaps she could have done things differently when it comes to the
Yeah.
legals. And then maybe, they hear your story, Nicole, and maybe they pay to review the certificate of title. I don't know. It's only like
Absolutely.
$200, but it kills me. Some people really don't want to part with that money, but it can become, as you say, $100,000 problem. You can end up with a defective title or a leaky
Yeah.
home or all of these other issues just on the basic due diligence, let alone moving into venture partnership when you're dealing with other people and the complexities. So
Yeah.
diversified portfolio, don't Scrooge on the legal fees. Any other kind of key learnings?
Yeah, I think that it's important to recognize when to think with your heart and when to think with your head. And I think that for a home, you can think with your heart, but for any other transaction, just use your head and discount your heart. And people often, when they're appraising a property, they'll come up with a base case, a neutral case, and a best case scenario. What I want you to do is scrap your best case and your mid case, go to your base case, and then go down 2 more levels and stress test that bottom level. And if that doesn't work, then walk away, because it's better to regret a property that you didn't buy than one you did.
And that's not often what people are told as well. And it's certainly not what I think I came on to this episode thinking you'd say, because someone who's bought that many properties. I'm like, you must love buying them. But yeah, I
Sorry.
guess yeah, no, it's refreshing. I guess it just goes to show that, there's still a level of discernment, and you don't just keep buying more and more properties and they miraculously all turn out. You've obviously
Yeah,
got to take the time, do the due diligence, and make sure that you really know what you're entering into every time,
yeah,
because I guess every time the more properties you have in your portfolio, the greater the entire risk that you're
yeah. No,
managing.
exactly. And it's got to be calculated. So I talked about the half a house that I purchased, and that was a very calculated, considered decision. And so I'm not going to say I'll never buy another property because I've been so burnt. That's not the case at all. But what I will do is I will analyze and I will analyze until I'm absolutely sure that this is going to work out. And it did, fortunately, and I made money on that particular one. And yeah, but so again, it's just about ensuring that you're being incredibly realistic. And what most people forget also is to factor in their time. Let's say you want to earn, I don't know, 100,000 a year. Okay, what's that on an hourly rate? how long is it going to take you to manage this particular property? And does that meet your hourly rate? And if it does, how much? How much are you going to charge that development? Because most people in property end up working for under minimum wage because they don't factor in a correct amount for themselves, or it just takes far too long. And don't forget the sleepless nights when financing doesn't go through, or things are not selling, or whatever it might be. So yeah, factor in that. I think people really get that wrong.
Yeah, do you know what? You're so right. That's across the board. I mean, I remember early stage having conversations with my friends that were going out contracting for the first time, or or just thinking about building any business venture, the venture that I'm in at Slice. And we do um we do unfortunately underestimate the hours, and therefore what the hourly rate is. And then it's like, actually you thought you're making all this money, but it's not quite an accurate representation,
No,
is it?
no, it
Well,
never is.
Um, before we finish off, you mentioned that you do have some sort of commercial investments as well, and I'm personally just very interested in that because I don't have investments in that space. What was that shift like into kind of commercial property?
Yeah, it was really by accident, all of the commercial, because they had residential elements that we were quite excited about. But then they had a commercial unit on the bottom, say flats above a shop, or flats above some sort of other retail space. And so it really was an accident that we had those. It was never set out to be a strategy. At first, we thought that they were going to be really good investments. Before COVID, we had Marks and Spencer sniffing around one. We had Majestic Wines sniffing around another. We had some really top names. But the way that you price commercial property is just the rental yield, uh, and it's all based just off the rental yield. So if you can get, you discount the rental yield, and that gets you the price. And so we very quickly realized that if you're going for one of the top names, they are a safer investment, so they pay a lower rent. And so you can get a
Ah,
Marks and Spencers in, but you might only get, say, a 5% return per annum. So when you think, or you might get someone opening a brand new coffee shop, and you might get, say, a 7% return. Now, when you factor those interest rates into the interest rate you're paying on the debt, and then when you think about the tax that you've got to pay, for example, you pretty quickly realize that you're not making any money on those commercial. The whole idea is that you've got your income component from the rent, but also you've got the capital growth component. And
mm,
then with COVID, the way that we use commercial spaces has completely changed. Our high streets, our main town centres, they're all dying. People are not wanting to go in and struggle to find parking. They tend to want to stay in their own little suburbs, and that's why what we're finding is places like co-working spaces popping up in suburban areas, because people just want to walk to work. They don't want to have to catch a train into town or struggle with parking. So yeah, the commercial experience has been an interesting one because I didn't know anything about it. More recently, there's been more demand for commercial spaces, so we have been able to sell them. But interestingly, the demand that we're getting they're from places like pop-up podcast studios, or it was all the workplace, little pop-up workplaces, communal working. But now that's changed to the podcast studios. So and actually, the evolution was gyms and then co-working and now podcasting. So you can see that's sort of the evolution of the demand that we had for these particular commercial studios or spaces that we had in central London that were around 5,000 to 10,000 square feet. That's sort of the demand cycle.
yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that changes as well, because obviously we're seeing, people are trying to enforce a certain amount of days in office. So it'll be interesting to see over the next, 5, 10 years how that post-COVID cycle changes. But yeah, interesting. Not as lucrative as perhaps first thought then. Another possibility, I guess, is thinking about business owners that are going to pay for the the rent anyway, or if they're having to pay the lease, I wonder if that makes more sense. If they're going to have to pay 5% or whatever it is, and then they take out the finance and they've got the stability and a bunch of other things. But yeah, a space that is a little bit more mature than most of our audience today, but still very interesting to hear. So thank you for sharing. I will close out with a little fun question we like to ask, Nicole, which is, if you're, let's say it can be your first home or your current home where you and the family live, if that home had a doorbell and that doorbell played a theme song, what song would it play?
Oh, the never-ending story theme.
Oh, that's so
That's
sweet.
such an emotional thing. It just makes me cry. I know it's not cool in any way, but it's just that na 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 na.
We
Anyway,
don't
I'm
have
not going
to
to sing
be
it for you.
cool here. That we're all about authenticity and making mistakes. Yeah. Not that never
Yeah.
ending story is a mistake.
Yeah, that's just the first thing that popped to mind. So there you go.
Love it. Thank you so much for joining us, Nicole.
Thank you for having me, Amy.
Thank you for joining our community. Please leave a Spotify or Apple review so we can support more people into home ownership. Check out today's episode notes for your free home buyer software and to get an estimate of what you could borrow today. A quick reminder, Slice the Podcast does not provide financial advice as we are not taking your personal circumstances into consideration. However, when you join our software platform, we have a team of financial advisors ready to support you free of charge.